Have you ever heard of a man who managed to live 15 years in a lonely cabin on the frontier, kept alive by nothing more than a single rule? No need to draw faster than the next gunman. No need for barbed wire around his land. Just the discipline of lying still and pretending to sleep. Because when strangers believe no one is listening, that's when the truth slips out. And that simple rule was how Elias Ward survived 100 knocks on his door in this lawless country. A fragile thread stretched across the deep canyon between life and death. If these opening words made your pulse quicken, then I invite you to stay with me. Hit the subscribe button. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from, maybe a sunlit porch, maybe a quiet room in the middle of a city. I promise you this, if you follow this story to the end, you'll find not only the silence of the West, but also a secret buried for 15 years and a choice between life and death that could change a man forever. Now let me take you back to the night when everything began to unravel. All that day, the air on the prairie carried the heavy weight of a storm rolling in. Elias Ward, a bearded man weathered by sun and solitude, could read the sky like scripture. The cattle pressed tight against the eastern fence. The horses pawed nervously at their stalls. And overhead, the sky turned the color of molten lead. Elias didn't fear storms. He'd lived through dust devils, hail, and lightning. What unsettled him more was the thought of strangers who might come knocking when the weather turned, because storms had a way of hiding more than thunder. And so it was. Just as lightning split the horizon and rain began to hammer the cabin roof, 3 deliberate knocks rattled the door. Elias rose, hand braced on the frame. In his years of exile, he'd answered many knocks: whiskey traders, lost prospectors, bounty hunters, even fugitives. Each time, he welcomed them in, then lay down and feigned sleep, waiting for them to betray themselves. The desperate prayed or groaned from hunger. The dangerous whispered schemes or prowled through his things. This time, when he cracked the door, he found 2 figures standing in the downpour. One was a slender young woman, leaning hard against the porch post, her face gaunt with pain from an injured leg. Beside her stood an older sister, tall and straight as a bow, dark eyes gleaming even in shadow. Their dresses were travel-worn, soaked through, their long black hair tangled by wind and rain, and in careful but clear English, the elder spoke. "Please, let us stay just for the night. My sister is hurt. She cannot travel farther in this storm." Elias's hand stayed firm on the doorframe. 15 years in a land without law had sharpened his instincts. Nothing that arrived at the exact right moment was ever harmless. There was a real town 12 miles south, with a proper inn. So why here? Why now? Their words sounded like pleading, but their eyes were steady, far too alert. "There's a town south of here," Elias said evenly, never breaking his gaze. "They've got rooms. This isn't a place to stay." The younger woman lifted her head, and in that brief look, Elias saw something that unsettled him more than the storm. Not just pain, not just weariness, something else, a spark of recognition, as if she'd seen him before. Lightning flared behind them, etching their silhouettes against the rain. The elder stepped forward, voice firmer. "We cannot go farther. Please." In that instant, Elias felt the old struggle rise in him. On one side, the instinct that had kept him alive: trust no one. Let suspicion be your shield. On the other, a shadow of a past he had tried hard to bury, stirred awake by the young woman's eyes. And all the while, the storm beat down, demanding a decision. He drew a long breath and finally stepped back. "All right, by the fire. But know this, I rise before dawn, and you'll be gone when I do." The elder dipped her head, but in her quiet yes. Elias heard not reassurance, but something colder, calculated. They entered, bringing with them the smell of rain and wet earth, mingling with the cabin's wood smoke. Elias turned away, letting them settle near the flames while he retreated to the narrow room in back. He lay down on the wooden cot, pulled the blanket over him, and closed his eyes as if drifting off. But every muscle was taut as drawn wire. This was the test. His one rule. He would pretend to sleep. And when the two women thought him deaf to their whispers, they would reveal their truth. Only this time, on a storm-struck night at the edge of nowhere, Elias Ward had no idea that he was the one about to be tested. That night, in the narrow back room, Elias Ward lay on his rough wooden cot, breathing slow and steady like a man already lost to sleep. But the truth was, not a single muscle in his body relaxed. Every joint, every nerve stayed tight, strung like wire ready to snap. He had used the pretend to sleep and listen rule 100 times before, and it had always revealed the truth. Yet tonight, with rain pounding the roof and thunder rolling like war drums outside, something felt different. At first, the whispers of the two sisters sounded like wind hissing through the cracks in the wall. But when Elias focused, the sounds took shape neither English nor any border dialect he'd grown used to hearing. It was Apache, and what froze him to the bone was not the language itself, but the fact that he understood every word. After 15 years of burying it, the language came rushing back, like an ember suddenly fanned into flame. "We've found him. Sister," the younger voice whispered, trembling but certain. Elias's heart slammed against his ribs. Him, who were they talking about? He forced his breathing to stay even, but his throat felt dry as ashes. The elder replied firmly, "Isela, be quiet. If he understands our tongue, he'll be listening." But look at him. The scar is still there, over the left brow. It's him. It can't be anyone else. Elias's hand drifted up, instinctively touching the thin line that split his eyebrow, a scar from the day everything fell apart. Nearly no one alive knew how he'd gotten it. And yet here these women were, whispering about it as if they had been there. What if he pretends to forget the younger pressed? He remembers. A man doesn't forget a name like Nantan. The question is whether he'll speak the truth or run again. That name Nantan hit Elias like a hammer to the chest. In an instant, the dark cabin dissolved into harsh sunlight, canyon winds, and the determined face of a young Apache. Nantan, the boy Elias once pulled from a flash flood. The 19-year-old who later fell in Silver Canyon. Elias's breath hitched. These sisters hadn't stumbled upon him by chance. They knew. They suspected him. Maybe they believed he had been the one to kill Nantan. The whispers continued, broken but clear enough in Elias's ears. They say there was a witness, someone who knew Nantan never drew his weapon, that he was murdered unjustly. And that witness was Elias Ward, Isela said bitterly, her voice tight with years of grief. But he stayed silent. He took silver to keep quiet. Elias squeezed his eyes shut. Each word felt like a knife twisting deeper. Yes, he had stayed silent. Yes, he had taken money, but not to conspire, only to survive. And yet, after 15 years, that excuse rang hollow even to him. Outside, the storm raged, inside Elias's chest. Another storm swelled even fiercer. They hadn't come as travelers in need. They had tracked him down, carrying the memory of a dead brother and the judgment of his silence. Tomorrow, when the sky clears, we confront him, Marisol whispered. If he lies, we make him pay. Elias wanted to leap up, to cry out that he hadn't pulled the trigger, that he had tried to warn Nantan, that 5 armed men had stood between him and the truth. But he lay motionless, because he knew that excuses spoken now would sound no better than cowardice. So he stayed still, heartbeat pounding, cold sweat dampening his shirt. Every drop of rain on the roof thudded like a drumbeat of an oncoming trial. A trial with no judge, no jury, only two women carrying the weight of their brother's blood. And Elias Ward understood, with grim certainty, that when dawn came, the truth would be dragged into the light whether he wanted it or not. In the suffocating dark of the back room, Elias Ward shut his eyes, but the past would not let him rest. The whispers of the two Apache sisters had forced open a door he had tried to keep locked. And once it swung wide, he was pulled backward 15 years, to an afternoon in Silver Canyon that had scarred his life as deeply as the white line above his brow. That day, the sky had been blinding blue, the sun pouring fire into the canyon, the air dry with dust and stone. Elias, then younger, not yet beaten down by solitude, rode beside Nantan. The boy was only 19, bright-eyed, bold, full of the need to prove himself. He'd spotted the stolen cattle driven into the canyon and insisted they confront the thieves. Elias had followed, unwilling to let him face danger alone. On a gravel flat, they found the rustlers 5 hard men with mean faces and liquor in their breath. At their center stood Silas Crowe, a wiry figure, scar running from ear to jaw, eyes sharp as a knife edge. He was a man who feared nothing except losing control. "You think some Indian boy can give me orders?" Silas sneered, his voice echoing like a beast's roar off the canyon walls. Nantan kept his hand near his knife but never drew it. He stood tall, voice steady. "Those cattle belong to us. Return them and leave. There doesn't need to be blood." Elias remembered it with painful clarity. Nantan kept his weapons sheathed, holding to honor and restraint. But Silas Crowe had no interest in honor. Elias saw the outlaw's hand inch toward his pistol. He opened his mouth to shout a warning too late. Steel flashed, thunder cracked, and in an instant Nantan collapsed in the dirt, blood spreading fast beneath him, eyes wide with shock. He had never even drawn his blade. Elias trembled behind the boulder where he'd been watching. He wanted to leap forward, to cry the truth, but 5 gun barrels swung toward him, cold and merciless. Silas, calm as if he'd swatted a fly, holstered his pistol and walked closer. "You saw it all, didn't you?" he said, voice low, casual. "The boy died like a fool. But you, Elias Ward, you've still got a chance. Speak a word of this, and you'll lie beside him." Elias could hardly breathe. Then Silas reached into his coat, drew out a pouch heavy with silver, and tossed it at his feet. "Take it. Payment for silence. From now on, you and me were partners. Don't go playing hero." Elias stared at the pouch, felt the weight of the metal and of his own fear. In Silas's eyes he saw death waiting for him if he refused. And so he nodded, a trembling nod that bartered his voice for survival. That night, Elias left Apache lands. He did not stand at Nantan's grave. He did not look his family in the eye. He carried away the killer's silver, and with it, a guilt that became his lifelong burden. For 15 years, Elias hid in his cabin on the plains, pretending Silver Canyon had ended with that gunshot. But every night the sound of Silas's pistol echoed in his mind. Every time he looked in a mirror, the scar above his brow reminded him that he wasn't just a witness, he was an accomplice. His fear was not only of Silas Crowe, who still walked free, grinding others beneath his boots. It was also of judgment the day someone like Marisol and Isela would appear, bearing Nantan's memory in their eyes and demanding payment for silence. And now, as rain lashed the cabin and the prairie winds howled, Elias knew the day he had dreaded most had finally come. Dawn crept into the cabin with a pale, colorless light, painting thin gray streaks across the wooden walls. After a night, without sleep, Elias Ward sat stiff on his narrow cot, listening to the faint crackle of dying embers in the hearth. There was no point pretending anymore. He knew the sisters had heard his uneven breathing through the night. They knew he was awake. They knew he had been waiting, like a condemned man awaiting judgment. When Elias stepped into the common room, Marisol and Isela were already there, waiting. Their faces were calm but unyielding, like women who had rehearsed this moment for 15 long years. Their silhouettes, framed by the dim morning glow, looked like figures stepped straight out of his guilty dreams. "You know what we're going to ask," Marisol said, her voice quiet, but as clear as a bell. Elias swallowed hard, his rough hands twisting together. "I didn't kill Nantan." Isela moved forward, eyes burning, "But you stayed silent. You watched him die, and you let the murderer walk free. Worse still, you took his silver." The word struck Elias like a hammer to the chest. He wanted to deny it, to shout that it wasn't true. But the memory of that heavy pouch of coins lying at his feet rose too vividly. He couldn't twist it away with excuses anymore. "Do you know what that silver was called?" Marisol asked, her eyes narrowing. "Blood money. You sold our brother's life." Elias trembled, throat tightening. All the explanations he had once clung to that he'd only wanted to survive, that one man couldn't stand against 5, crumbled to dust. Before these women, they were nothing but the flimsy rags of cowardice. "What do you want from me?" Elias whispered hoarsely. Isela's hands clenched into fists as she stepped closer. "We want you to help us find Silas Crowe, and when he falls, we want you standing there, forced to watch justice done." The room seemed to close in on him, air pressing like a stone on his chest. To help them kill Silas meant stepping straight back into the nightmare he had fled for half his life. But to refuse Marisol's voice cut like ice. "If you don't agree, we'll tell the world the truth. Everyone will know Elias Ward, the man who took blood money to bury a murder." Fear flooded him, hot and choking. He knew how harsh this frontier was. Reputation was everything. If the truth spread, no town would trade with him. No ranch would hire him. He would be driven out like a leper, left to starve in the wilderness. He stood caught between 2 blades, guilt on one side, ruin on the other. "You don't understand." He tried, voice breaking. "I was afraid. You chose silver over truth," Isela cut in, her tone sharp as steel. "We don't need to hear more." Marisol touched her sister's shoulder, steadying her, then turned back to Elias. "You still have one chance. This time, stand with justice instead of running. Don't let our brother die a second time in silence." Elias bowed his head. The cabin fell into a stillness broken only by the wind sighing through the cracks. In his mind he saw Nantan again, proud stance, bright eyes, and then that terrible fall into the dirt. Alongside it came the memory of the pouch of silver, heavy, damning. The truth was too heavy to keep running from, yet fear still crushed him. He felt like a man standing on a cliff edge, one step away from a fall with no bottom. "Silas isn't just a thief," Isela said quietly, words like a knife sliding between ribs. "He's your shadow. Help us find him, or let that shadow consume you forever. The choice is yours." Elias gave no reply. He only stood there, hand shaking against the doorframe, eyes fixed on the floorboards. In the gray morning light, his face bore the weight of guilt and a fear he could no longer hide. And he understood from this moment forward, there would be no turning back. Morning light filtered into the cabin, just enough to show the deep lines carved into Elias Ward's face. He stood silent, bearing the weight of their accusations, every breath a burden. But Marisol wasn't finished. She fixed her gaze on him, sharp and cutting, like a blade pressed against an old wound. "You think we came only for a confession," she said, her tone steady, iron strong. "No. We came for something bigger. Silas Crowe is alive, and he's no petty thief anymore. Elias's head lifted, his heart missing a beat. For years he had hoped-prayed that the man was gone, dead in some drunken brawl or swinging from a noose in a distant town. But that fragile hope vanished as Marisol went on. "He's built himself an army," she said. "Not just a handful of drifters, but dozens of men. They live off raids, supply wagons, stolen cattle, murdered travelers. He has a network now. Men who'd rather die than betray him." Isela's fists clenched, her voice trembling with rage. "Do you know what he calls you? Elias Ward, partner. He brags in saloons that you're the reason he walked free, that you took his silver, kept your mouth shut, and gave him the space to build his empire from our brother's blood." Elias felt himself sag, as if someone had thrown a bucket of filth in his face. The name Silent Partner stuck like a brand. In his mind he saw every raid, every body Silas had left behind, and realized each one bore the shadow of his silence. "No, it can't be," Elias rasped. I was never his partner." Marisol's eyes did not soften. "You took his silver. In his eyes. In the world's eyes. That's enough." The room tilted around him. The guilt he had carried for 15 years pressed harder than ever, now twisted with fresh shame. His silence had not just betrayed Nantan. It had unleashed Silas to slaughter and steal for years, unchecked. Every innocent life cut down since then felt like another weight chained to Elias's soul. Isela leaned closer, her voice low and merciless. "And he's coming for you. Right now." Elias's eyes snapped wide. "For me, yes," Marisol said. "We tracked him through men who served him. Silas is planning something big, a payroll convoy through Devil's Canyon. Enough silver to set him up for life. And he says only one man can help him pull it off. The man he trusts never to talk. His old partner." A chill ran down Elias's spine. He heard again Silas's words from 15 years ago. "You and me. Partner. Don't go playing hero." All these years Elias thought he had escaped, that time and distance had buried him. But the truth crashed down. He had only ever been a prisoner in hiding. A hostage to silence. "God Almighty," Elias whispered, his hand trembling against the table. "He knows where I am. He's always known." Shame and regret surged, heavier than the storm outside. Not only had he let Nantan die without justice, his silence had fed a monster. Every family Silas had shattered. Every life stolen since that day. Elias felt as if their blood stained his hands. He bowed his head, voice breaking like a man confessing at the gallows, every death at his hands. "Part of it is mine." Marisol said nothing. She simply watched him, her silence more cutting than words, like a judge waiting for a guilty man's choice. The small room felt suffocating. No rain, no wind, only the thunder of Elias's heart filling the silence. He understood then all these years in exile hadn't been penance. They had been hiding. And now hiding was over. Silas Crowe was coming, and Elias Ward had no place left to run. The sisters' warning had barely cooled when, by noon that same day, dust was already rising across the prairie, through the cabin's narrow window. Elias Ward saw 3 riders approaching, their horses moving slow but steady, as if the whole land parted for them. The man in front was Silas Crowe, older now, streaks of gray in his hair, but still carrying the cold authority of a man long accustomed to dealing in death. 2 younger gunmen flanked him, their hard faces and sharp eyes marking them as killers. Elias's chest tightened. After 15 years, his nightmare rode straight into his yard. His hand trembled, but when his eyes met those of Marisol and Isela, he saw not fear, but a resolve that burned steady as flame. They would not flinch, and Elias knew if he turned away again, he would lose what little remained of his soul. The hoofbeats stopped at the porch. Silas swung down, his voice booming like a man claiming his own land. "Elias Ward, old partner, get yourself out here. It's time we had a talk." From the shadows of the cabin, Elias stepped into the light. Every footfall felt like dragging the weight of his past behind him. Silas's face was more lined, but his eyes still cut like steel. "I knew I'd find you here," he sneered. "You've hid well, but never well enough." "I was never your partner," Elias said, his voice rough but steady. Silas raised a brow, a dangerous grin spreading. "You took my silver, in my book. That makes you a partner. And today I've come to collect what you owe." Before Elias could answer, another voice cut through the air. Silas Crowe. He spun around. In the doorway stood Marisol, rifle steady, its barrel leveled at his chest. Isela stepped out beside her, pistols raised at his men. For an instant, Silas's face went white. "No, it can't be." "It can," Marisol said, her tone like granite. "The sisters of the boy you murdered stand here. And you know exactly which uncle betrayed his own blood." The truth crashed over Elias like thunder. Silas was not just a killer, he was their blood. An uncle who had slaughtered his own nephew for profit, then built an empire on that betrayal. Isela stepped forward, voice trembling with rage. "You killed Nantan. Your own nephew's blood is on your hands." Silas's jaw clenched. Then he barked back. He was reckless, always stirring trouble with the tribes, making life harder for us all. "I did what had to be done." "No," Marisol said coldly. "Family doesn't kill family to keep the peace. Family doesn't betray family for silver." The two gunmen shifted uneasily, their fingers loose on their weapons as they saw the sisters' unshaking aim. Elias's heart thundered. The moment of choice was upon him. Bow his head as before, or stand tall beside the truth. Drawing a breath, Elias stepped forward, shoulder to shoulder with the sisters. "I saw you kill Nantan," he declared, his voice carrying across the yard. "He never drew a weapon. You shot him down like a dog, then paid me to keep quiet. And I took it. But today, I won't stay silent." Silas's face twisted with fury. "You betray me, Ward, after 15 years of silence. Now you open your mouth." Elias held firm, fists tight at his sides, but his voice was calm in a way that startled even him. "For 15 years, I lived like a ghost. Enough. You called me partner. But I was nothing but a coward. Today, I choose different." A heavy stillness fell, broken only by the wind sighing across the prairie. Marisol and Isela stood like stone, their eyes locked on Silas, rifles unwavering. Three people, bound by a single past, each forced to face it at last. This was no longer just the clash of a killer and a witness. It was family confronting betrayal, fear colliding with courage. Elias knew, whatever the end, he had finally chosen to stand on the side of truth. And for the first time in years, Elias Ward felt what it meant to face his demons head on. The heavy silence in the yard pressed down like 15 years of buried guilt on Elias Ward's shoulders. Wind swept across the prairie, stirring dust around the figures locked in their standoff a killer. Two nieces seeking justice, and the man who had stayed silent too long. Elias drew a deep breath, and for the first time since Silver Canyon, he let the truth pour out without disguise. "Listen well," Elias said, his voice carrying with the wind. "Nantan never drew a weapon. I stood there and watched Silas Crowe shoot down an unarmed boy, then shove silver into my hand to buy my silence. And I took it. I betrayed the truth. I betrayed him. But today, I will not stay silent any longer." The confession shattered the air. Silas's two gunmen exchanged uneasy looks. Marisol tightened her grip on the rifle, her face hard but her eyes flashing with a spark of hope the witness had finally chosen justice. Silas roared, his face twisting crimson with fury. "Shut your mouth." Ward, after all these years, you break our deal now. You think you can play the hero?" Elias stood tall, his shoulders squared. Not a hero, just a coward who finally wants to make it right. Silas's hand flashed, drawing his pistol, but Elias had been waiting for this. He lunged forward, colliding with the wiry outlaw, both men crashing to the dirt. The gun skittered away as they wrestled, fists pounding, curses tearing the air. 15 years of fear and shame exploded in every blow. The two gunmen raised their weapons, but Isela and Marisol stepped forward, barrels leveled with deadly precision. "Drop them," Isela shouted, her hands trembling but her aim true. "Or you die with him." In seconds, the younger men faltered. Seeing the sisters' steady stance, they hesitated, then let their guns fall, hands rising in surrender. Loyalty was one thing, suicide another. On the ground, Elias and Silas rolled in the dust, grappling like beasts. Sweat stung Elias's eyes. His muscles burned, but his will blazed hotter than ever. He was no longer fighting just for survival. He was fighting to prove to Nantan, and to himself, that he would not hide anymore. Silas broke free, fingers closing around his pistol. He swung it up, muzzle aimed at Elias. Time seemed to freeze, then thunder cracked. The shot came not from Silas, but from Marisol's rifle. The bullet struck true, slamming into Silas's chest. His body jerked, eyes wide in disbelief. He staggered, coughed blood, and crumpled into the dirt. The pistol slipped from his grasp. Silence fell heavy. Only the wind moved, carrying the acrid tang of gunpowder across the yard. Elias lay on his back, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the lifeless body of the man who had haunted his soul for half a lifetime. Silas Crowe, who once called him partner, was nothing more than a husk bleeding into the earth. Isela lowered her pistols slowly, her arms trembling. Marisol held her rifle steady until she was certain. Then she turned to Elias. "You chose," she said, her voice low but firm. "You chose truth over silence." Elias pushed himself upright, his chest rising and falling. Tears blurred his vision as he looked at the sisters. Too late, but maybe not too late to set a piece of it right. He turned to the two gunmen, who stood pale and shaken, hands still raised. "You've got one chance," Elias said, his voice hoarse but steady. "Go. Tell everyone what happened here. Tell them Silas Crowe is dead, and tell them the truth about Nantan's death." The men glanced at each other, then nodded quickly, scrambling for their horses. Within moments they rode hard across the prairie, eager to be gone. Only 3 remained in the yard. The wind carried the mingled scents of blood, dust, and gun smoke. Elias felt his shoulders lighten, as if the stone of 15 years had finally rolled off his back. He was no longer the man who kept silent. He had chosen to face the truth. Marisol stepped close, laying a hand on his shoulder. "You cannot erase the past," she said, her voice softening. "But you stepped out of the shadows. That's enough for our brother to rest." Elias nodded, lips trembling. For the first time in years, his eyes shone not with fear, but with determination. Determination to live on not as a fugitive from his past, but as a man who had finally begun to make amends. That afternoon, the prairie lay bathed in a golden light, the sky strangely clear after a storm of blood. The ground still smelled of rain, the grass darkened green, and the wind carried a sharp, clean breath Elias Ward had not felt in 15 years. In front of the cabin, a grave was dug in silence. No prayer was spoken. No marker placed, only 3 figures and their shadows stretched long across the dirt as they lowered Silas Crowe into the hole. Marisol was the first to put down the shovel. Her face showed little, but sorrow clouded her eyes, the sorrow of knowing that her own blood could betray so completely. Isela stood rigid, her fist clutching a handful of dirt before she let it fall into the grave like a bitter farewell. Finally, Elias, his hands trembling, but firm, took the shovel and poured earth over the man he had once obeyed in silence. Each thud of soil on the coffinless body sounded like a hammer striking shut the door of the past. When the grave was filled, the wind swept the dust away, leaving a nameless mound. No one wanted to mark it. No one wanted to remember. Silas Crowe, the man who sowed death, was gone to the earth like any other forgotten outlaw. That evening, they sat by the fire in front of the cabin. Silence wrapped them, broken only by the crackle of flames and the faint chorus of crickets in the grass. Elias slipped into his back room and returned with a weathered leather pouch. For 15 years, it had never left the cabin. It had been a wound, a burden, the proof of his cowardice. But now, in Elias's shaking hand, it had become something else. "This is blood money," Elias said, his voice rough. "The silver he gave me to buy my silence. I kept it because I was afraid, too afraid to spend it, too afraid to touch it. But now, I give it to you. Use it to rebuild what he destroyed. Don't let it remain only a symbol of betrayal." Marisol took the pouch, her eyes searching his. "You know this silver won't erase your sins, I know." Elias nodded, a weary smile flickering. "But maybe it can begin something new. I can't give you back the past, but I can help you take a step toward tomorrow." Isela said nothing, but her eyes shone with a fragile light, as if the rage and grief she had carried so long had been laid down in the same grave as her uncle. 3 days later, the sisters left. On that morning, Elias led his horse into the yard and stood watching as they rode toward the horizon, where the grass rolled endlessly. Marisol turned once and gave a single nod in place of thanks. Isela lifted a hand in farewell, the trace of a smile breaking through the first since the day they'd met. Then their figures grew small, swallowed by the rising sun. Elias stood alone at the cabin, the wind tugging at his silvered hair, his chest light as though the stone he had carried for 15 years had been set down in that nameless grave. No more fear of exposure, no more shadow of Silas stalking him. Only a quiet peace, as though the land itself had chosen to forgive him. That night, Elias sat before the hearth, the firelight dancing across his lined face. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in 15 years, sleep came without nightmares. No gunfire echoed from Silver Canyon, no accusing stare of Nantan in the dark, only deep, dreamless rest and the promise of a new dawn. For a man who had lived half a lifetime in the shadow of his own cowardice, the moment felt like a miracle. Elias Ward, once called the silent partner, could at last live as a free man, free with the truth spoken and his conscience unshackled. My friends, this is where I want to pause and ask you if you were in Elias's place. Would you have the courage to speak the truth, even if it meant risking your life? 15 years of running brought him nothing but nightmares. One moment of courage brought him peace. That is a lesson not only for the Old West, but for our lives today. If this story touched your heart, give Elias your support. Leave a comment. What should he do now? Should he return to the Apache people and ask for their forgiveness? Or should he remain here, on this land, and for the first time, build a life rooted in truth? And before you go, don't forget to subscribe, so we can keep bringing you more Western Tales stories where men face themselves, where justice doesn't always come from the law, but sometimes from a late-found courage. That night, in the first peaceful sleep he had known in 15 years, Elias Ward smiled faintly. He knew the old chapter had closed, and a new one unknown. But waiting had finally begun.